Okay, here we go with our first set of notes for our ecology unit. In this set of notes we're going to focus on kind of the basics of ecology, what ecology is, some of the key terms. We're going to move towards talking about population growth, so how populations change in an ecosystem and stuff like that. So first off, what is ecology? Everyone always says, whenever asked this question, ecology is the study of ecosystems. And that's true, but what is an ecosystem? When you study ecology, what are you studying? Are you only studying the animals? Well, no, there's lots of things that affect the animals and how they get along with each other and how they eat each other and all this stuff. There's living parts of the world, there's non-living parts of the world, and all of them are working together. So ecology is, pretty simply, the study of the interactions between organisms in the living parts of their world as well as the non-living parts of their world. So everything's connected to each other. Of course, the living parts of the world, that's fairly obvious. We call those the biotic factors. So living is biotic, like biology is the study of life. Pretty simple. You guys can probably figure this out. Animals, plants, bacteria, fungi, things like that. I mean, the plants and animals those are the easy ones. We also can't forget about those fungi and those little tiny things that are breaking down waste or making you sick, things like that. That's all living. Those are all living organisms. And then the non-living parts of the world are called abiotic factors. So remember, you stick the letter A in front of something and it usually means without. So the non-living things are called abiotic factors. And some examples of abiotic factors that might affect organism or a group of organisms. Obviously, sunlight is a big one because sunlight is going to be affecting plants through photosynthesis, and we'll be talking a little bit later about how plants pretty much help everything else. Wind could affect where things grow or how well things grow. Precipitation, so how much rain are you getting, how much snow are you getting, is there enough water, what kind of plants can that sustain, what kind of animals can that sustain. The soil or the rocks, can plants get a root there? What types of plants can get root there? Can animals burrow down in there? Can animals find shelter? All those sorts of things. And then, of course, water would be another big one because we all know about how much water sustains life. All this kind of goes together with the overarching theme of this unit, and I'm going to kind of hit on this all the time, is that everything is interconnected. All right? Changes affect lots of organisms. You change one little thing, and that's going to affect one organism, and that's going to affect another organism and another organism. Or changes to one abiotic factor might affect organisms and other abiotic factors. For example, if we had more sunlight, or if there was greater temperature, right, that could be good for the plants because they like, obviously, sunlight, but that could also negatively impact the amount of water if there's more evaporation, which would then negatively affect plants and negatively affect everything. So it's all sort of interconnected because then the amount of plants is going to affect the amount of animals and so on and so forth. So some of the terms that we're going to be talking about is how organisms are organized into different levels of ecosystems and communities and groups of interacting species. So the first off, the most simple level of organization would be an organism. Right, so that's just one individual. We've talked about organisms before. That shouldn't be a new term for you. And then when you have a group of the similar species, that's a population. Right? So we talk about the population of humans would be all the humans. Usually we talk about it in a country, but you could talk about it in a region or the world or whatever. Or the population of meerkats or the population of whales or whatever. Actually, it wouldn't just be whales. It would be a specific species of whale, I suppose. And we group a bunch of different species that are working together into a community. So a community would be a collection of different organisms. And then you can probably see where we're going here. An ecosystem would be then a group of interacting communities. So this group A is affecting group B, which is affecting group C, and so on and so forth, working together or apart. And then a biome would be a group of similar ecosystems. So you've probably studied biomes before. You've got like the tundra and the grasslands and the deciduous forests and all those sorts of things. And so it's different climates then kind of dictate what sorts of animals live there. So you end up having similar animals and plants. And then obviously all the biomes in the world make up the biosphere, which is all the habitable parts of the planet. And you can see this, all this down this little graphic. You got the one organism, population, would be a bunch of elk. The community being that elk plus the moose that are probably sharing food with it. This guy that might be hunting it. This guy that might be stealing food from it. This guy that is doing something to him, who knows what. And then an ecosystem would be, you've got several different communities affecting each other. All these guys living in this biome right here, and the biome being one part of the biosphere. The ecological niche is another term that we talk about a lot in ecology. And the niche is just a species' role in its environment, or like its job. You may have heard people talk about this with humans, like, oh, I'm looking to find my niche, or such and such a person still hasn't found their niche in life. Right? They haven't figured out what they want to do. They don't know what kind of job they want to get, if they want to go to college, if they want to go in the military, these sorts of things. And this all comes from, actually, the French term, this is a niche. Right here in architecture, it's just like a little spot in the wall, a little hole where something goes, usually a little statue, a little vase, right? But this is your spot, or not your spot, but that statue's spot. So a niche in ecology is your spot in the world, what you do, what your job is, all that good stuff. And the niche is just based on conditions that an organism can tolerate. So is it going to fit in this temperature range? Can it go outside this temperature range, or is it stuck in this 65 to 75 degrees Fahrenheit? Does it have the food that it needs? Does this area have meet its nesting needs? Can it get everything it needs to do to reproduce? Are there enough mates? Those sorts of things. And there's two different ways we can break down the niche. You've got the fundamental niche, right? So the range of conditions a species could tolerate. So this is basically the biggest possible thing, right? It's maximum niche, you can think about it. And then you also have the realized niche, which is the range a species actually uses. Right? So generally speaking, a generalist is going to have a big niche, because think of somebody who's a generalist, they can do almost anything. They're not a specialist, so they have a big niche. They can eat lots of food. They can survive in lots of temperatures. So they might have many roles in the environment, versus a specialist might have a very, very small niche. Right? Like if you look at these birds over here, we talked about bird beak before. They all have different sized beaks. Right? Each different beak is very well adapted to eating a certain kind of food, certain seeds, or in this case, it talks about eating seeds and fruits, insects, grubs, a tool-using finch. So these guys all have beaks that are very, very specialized. So these would have a small niche, right? Like this guy's job in that ecosystem is eating insects, versus some other bird that might have much larger niche, like maybe something like a vulture could be basically ready to eat any type of dead, decomposing prey. So is a little less specialized. Moving on to population growth, which is be the last of the topics we're going to talk about today. Population growth is affected by lots of things, and they can basically be broken down into being affected by the birth rate, right? So how many critters are born, mortality, how many of them die. But then, in addition to that, if you're looking at the population growth of a certain population or within an ecosystem, you could have some individuals immigrating or moving into the population, and some might be leaving. They might decide that they don't like it here, they're going to go somewhere else and look for better pastures, so to speak, somewhere else. So the size of population mostly going to be affected by birth and death rates, but also some things moving in and moving out. Now there's two different types of population growth, or two different population growth models. The first one we're going to talk about is called exponential growth. Right? And this is a rapid population growth. So even after the population gets large, it keeps on growing. Right? You might ask, is that even possible for a population just to keep going? Well, yeah, sort of. It is possible for a short period of time, or if you're like maybe in a lab situation where you're culturing an organism. A good example of something that could do this would be bacteria. So the population starts out small, and every bacterium produces two bacteria, and those guys produce two bacteria, and each of those produce two bacteria, and very quickly that population grows and grows and grows and grows. Right? What would stop a population from growing like that? Usually they run out of food, so limited by nutrients, or their waste just builds up, right? And eventually that kills them, because waste is toxic. That's why you're getting rid of it. You don't want it anymore. And if it builds up, that could kill you. However, if you're in a lab or something like that, you might have a situation where they have basically endless supply of food, or somebody helps clean up after them, so you don't have that happening. So you can see some logistic growth over a short period of time. So I would go ahead and, if I were you, pause the presentation and maybe draw this little graph off to the side of your notes next to exponential growth. It'll be helpful a little bit later. So the other type of population growth is logistic growth. So this is kind of similar to the exponential growth, except that this growth model includes limiting factors. So this talks about what's going to happen when population is limited by nutrients or limited by the waste buildup and things like that. And so we talk about the limitations in growth as being the carrying capacity. So how many individuals can a certain ecosystem carry, right? The number of individuals an environment can sustain for a long time. So they might be able to carry some for a little bit of time, but eventually things might go wrong and wouldn't be able to carry as many individuals. So I'm going to say go ahead and draw this graph, right, on your paper somewhere, probably just off to the right or just below a little bit. Label up your axes. We've got time on the x-axis, population size, and then I've got this dashed line here, which is going to represent our carrying capacity. And so I want to try a little thought experiment here. So if we've got a population that starts out really, really small, and they're reproducing, and they're just kind of chugging along, increasing in number, increasing in number, increasing in number, and still they're starting to approach the carrying capacity. Right? They're approaching how many organisms this environment can carry. What I would like you guys to do is you can draw in my line, maybe in a dark color, and then I want you to draw what you think this line is going to do from this point forward. Maybe you could use a dotted line or something like that to distinguish them. So what is going to happen to this line? Is it going to keep going up and then crash? Is it going to cruise along this dotted line? Is it just going to go down immediately? Is it going to do some other pattern you think about? So go ahead and draw what you think it's going to do. Okay, so now that you've drawn that, the last couple of things I want to talk about is what sorts of things can affect population growth in this logistic model. We talk about density-independent factors of population growth, and we also talk about density-dependent factors. Right? A density-independent factor, something like weather or a natural disaster, these are things that are going to limit the population no matter what. Right? It doesn't matter what the density of the population is, how many animals there are in a given area. This is totally independent of that. So this weather, this natural disaster, whatever, it's going to hit this ecosystem whether there's 500 deer there or whether there's 5,000 deer there. Right? It doesn't matter. Right? That tornado is going to come through no matter what. And obviously if a tornado came through, that would or could limit the growth of the population because it's going to destroy a bunch of trees and might destroy habitat, it might limit access to food, and so the population might go down. The flip side of that is density-dependent factors. So these are the sorts of things that are going to affect a population more as it gets larger. So these are mostly going to be things like resource limitation. Right? So as a population gets really, 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 really big, it's going to be harder and harder and harder to find food. Right? Or another thing you could think about would be disease. The bigger a population is, the more likely disease might pass from one individual to another, thus limiting the population. Right? So all these sorts of things, they depend on how many animals or plants or whatever are living in an ecosystem. Usually, if there's more animals or plants or whatever, then they're something that's more likely to limit their population growth. Okay. With that, we'll wrap up this presentation and talk about some of this stuff next time in class.